Haiphong, Vietnam, June 2008. A 74-year-old retired colonel sits on a leather sofa in his living room and shows a visiting American reporter a framed photograph of himself in uniform standing in front of captured U.S. pilots before their release in 1973. His name is Tran Trong Duyet. He was the commandant of Hoa Lo Prison from 1968 until February of 1973, when the last of his American prisoners walked out. The Americans called the place the Hanoi Hilton. Duyet asked across 40 years what he remembered about the men who would not cooperate with him, says one of them gave him English lessons. He says they became friends. He says he would vote for John McCain if he could. He does not say what happened inside the prison. Almost 600 American servicemen passed through Hoa Lo and the network of camps around it. 28 died there. The guards had names for the loud ones, the senior ones, the stubborn ones. The Americans had names for the guards. This is the story the men in the photograph were never asked to tell. The prison was originally Maison Centrale, built by the French between 1896 and 1901 to hold Vietnamese political prisoners. The Vietnamese called it Hoa Lo, the stove, after the wood stove and coal stove shops that once lined the street. By the time the French withdrew in 1954, more than 2,000 Vietnamese had been held inside its 20-foot walls of barbed wire and broken glass. On August 5, 1964, Hoa Lo received its first American. Lieutenant Junior Grade Everett Alvarez, Jr., a Navy A-4 pilot, had been shot down off the Gulf of Tonkin earlier that day. He was 26. He would spend the next 8.5 years inside the system. Hundreds of downed American aviators followed. The North Vietnamese did not call them prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions, the regime maintained, did not apply. These were criminals, air pirates in the official phrasing, who had bombed civilians in an illegal war. They had no rights. They could be interrogated. They could be filmed. They could be made to speak. A problem developed. The Americans began organizing. In June of 1965, 4 officers inside Hoa Lo introduced a tap code based on a 5x5 letter grid first used by American POWs in Korea. Captain Carlisle Harris, Lieutenant Philip Butler, Lieutenant Robert Peel, and Lieutenant Commander Robert Shoemaker. Tapping on walls, water pipes, and the bottoms of bunks, the men passed names, warnings, and orders from cell to cell. Air Force pilot Ron Bliss later said the prison sounded like a den of runaway woodpeckers. A command structure formed. Robinson Risner, an Air Force lieutenant colonel and Korean War ace whose face had appeared on the April 23, 1965 cover of Time magazine, became senior ranking officer after he was shot down on September 16th of that year. James Stockdale, a Navy commander who had led the first American airstrike against North Vietnam, was shot down a week earlier and became the senior naval officer. Both were isolated in solitary. Both gave orders anyway. Risner's doctrine was simple. Resist until you are tortured. Do not take torture to the point where you lose the permanent use of your limbs. Stockdale codified the rules of resistance into an acronym: BAC US, Unity over Self. The North Vietnamese wanted 3 things. They wanted military intelligence, they wanted written confessions of war crimes, and most of all, they wanted recordings, broadcasts, films, signed statements that could be used to validate North Vietnam's claim that the war was unjust. By late 1965, the camp authority took the 3rd thing seriously. A unit of interrogators was assigned to break the senior officers. The Americans never learned the real names of most of these men, so they named them. The chief torturer they called Pig Eye. Pig Eye specialized in the rope trick, arms tied behind the back, bound at the wrists, then ratcheted closer together until the elbows touched and the shoulders pulled out of their sockets. Pig Eye later switched from rope to nylon straps captured from American parachutes. The chief indoctrinator they called Rabbit. The chief interrogator they called Cat. The others were Bug, Frenchie, Greasy, Lump, Mickey Mouse, Owl, Chihuahua, Soft Soap, Slopehead, Hitler, Dum Dum. The names were not affectionate. The names were memory aids, so that the cell that took Pig Eye yesterday could warn the cell taking him tomorrow. By May of 1966, the camp authority believed it had broken Jeremiah Denton. Denton, a Navy commander, had been shot down on July 18, 1965, near Thon Hoa, flying an A-6A Intruder off the carrier USS Independence. He had been tortured for 10 months. He told the Los Angeles Times years later that they beat you with fists and fan belts, threatened you with death, then got serious and gave you the rope trick. On May 2, 1966, the North Vietnamese sat Denton in front of a Japanese television crew for a propaganda interview. He was emaciated, and the studio lights were bright. While Denton answered the reporters' questions with verbal support for the American government, not the script he had been given, he blinked his eyes in Morse code. T-O-R-T-U-R-E. The film was broadcast. U.S. Naval Intelligence saw it. For the first time, Washington had visual evidence that the North Vietnamese were torturing American POWs. Denton was punished afterwards. He would receive the Navy Cross for the blink. 2 months later, on July 6, 1966, 52 American POWs were trucked into downtown Hanoi, bound in pairs, and marched through the streets between a crowd the propaganda staff had organized. Rabbit ordered the men to bow their heads. Denton passed word down the line to stand tall. The march turned into a near riot, and the prisoners were beaten by civilians along a 2-mile route. International coverage condemned it. The plan was not repeated. Risner, when his turn came, tried to destroy his voice rather than read a script for Radio Hanoi. He pounded his throat with judo chops until he could barely speak. When that failed, he mashed lye soap into a paste, gargled it, and screamed into a rag clamped over his mouth. Forced to read the statement anyway, he delivered it in a thick, fake German accent with deliberately mispronounced words. The North Vietnamese understood what he was doing. They tortured him again. On July 4, 1968, the camp authority offered John Sidney McCain III an early release. McCain had been shot down on October 26, 1967, hit by a Soviet anti-aircraft missile over Truc Bac Lake while bombing Hanoi's electric power plant. He had broken both arms and a leg, ejecting. His father was Admiral John S. McCain, Jr. The propaganda value of releasing the son of a senior Admiral American was obvious. McCain refused. The American Code of Conduct required prisoners be released in order of capture, and men who had been in Hoa Lo longer had to go first. The camp commander snapped a pen in two and walked out. Rabbit, a Vietnamese interpreter named Nguyen Minh U, who had learned English from an American priest in Bangkok in the 1940s, turned to McCain and said, "Now things will be very bad for you, Mac." They were. By September of 1969, the resistance leadership was 4 years into solitary confinement. Risner had 3 years in a darkened cell with rats. Stockdale had been tortured 15 times and kept in leg irons for months at a stretch. The camp authority decided to use Stockdale, the senior naval officer, in a major propaganda event. He would be cleaned up, fed, brought before international press, and broadcast as evidence of humane treatment. Stockdale slashed his scalp open with a razor. The guards bandaged him and stuffed a hat over the wound. He grabbed a wooden stool and beat himself in the face until his features were a mass of swelling and blood. The film was cancelled. Threatened with the torture of another prisoner unless he agreed to confess on camera, Stockdale took a shard of window glass and slashed his own wrists. The guards found him before he bled out and revived him. His Medal of Honor citation, written years later, said, "The North Vietnamese, convinced of his indomitable spirit, abated in their employment of excessive harassment and torture toward all the prisoners of war." Stockdale was one of 11 men the camp authority had marked as the worst of the leaders. On October 25, 1967, those 11, Stockdale, Denton, Sam Johnson, James Mulligan, Howard Rutledge, Robert Shoemaker, Harry Jenkins, Ron Stores, Nels Tanner, George McKnight, and George Coker had been moved out of Hoa Lo to a separate facility a mile away, dug into a courtyard behind the North Vietnamese Ministry of National Defense. Stockdale named it Alcatraz. The cells were 3 feet by 9 feet. The men were shackled in leg irons every night. The lights were left on around the clock. They were tortured in order of rank, highest first. Coker, the youngest and lowest in rank, was taken last. He said later he was grateful for every minute the others held out. The 10 survivors were moved out on December 9, 1969. Air Force Captain Ron Stores, debilitated by sickness and untreated injuries, was left behind. He died at Alcatraz on April 23, 1970. His remains were repatriated 4 years later. On September 2, 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. The conditions in the camps eased. The camp authority believed orders to torture had come down from him personally. A declassified Politburo resolution dated November 20, 1969, later surfaced by the historian Merle Pribinov, directed Hoa Lo's administrators to provide better food, cleaner cells, and mail from home. The resolution did not call the Americans POWs. It called for application of Geneva Convention principles in a manner consistent with humanitarian policies. In November of 1970, the failed American raid on Son Tay convinced the North Vietnamese to consolidate the outlying camps back into Hoa Lo. The POWs called the new section Camp Unity. They cheered the December 1972 B-52 raids on Hanoi from inside their cells. On February 12, 1973, the first American POWs walked onto C-141 transports at Gia Lam Airport in Gia Lam. By March 29, all 591 had been released. Denton spoke first on the tarmac at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. "We are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances." The prison was demolished between 1993 and 1994. Most of the site is now Hanoi Towers, a 27-story service department building and a 14-story office tower. The gatehouse survives as a museum. The American POW section is 1 room. Veterans who have visited say it does not match what happened to them. The Vietnamese government's official position has not changed in half a century since the release. There was no torture. There were a few slaps. The worst that befell the most resistant prisoners was confinement to small cells. In 2000, the dissident North Vietnamese Colonel Bui Tin, who had personally interrogated McCain and who in 1975 had been among the officers present at the surrender of Saigon, told an interviewer in exile that the worst the Americans had endured were a few physical hits, like a slap across the face or threats.
In 2008, the foreign correspondent Matt Steinglass tracked down Tran Trong Duyet at his house in Haiphong. Duyet repeated the line, "There was no torture. McCain was his friend." Steinglass also located Colonel Pan Van Hoa, who had run the technical department of the Army Film Studio during the war. Hoa said, "We used to film them when they didn't know they were being filmed." He located the translator Nguyen Minh U, the man McCain remembered as Rabbit. U was in retirement the head of international relations for the Vietnam Association of Victims of Agent Orange. Asked if McCain's allegations of torture were true, he used a Vietnamese idiom for ingratitude. He eats the rice and kicks the bowl. He went into the hospital a few days later. His family said his blood pressure had spiked and asked the American reporter not to call again. What the guard said about the Americans who would not break is in the end what every guard says about every uncooperative prisoner. He was stubborn, he had a strong personality, he was a real hawk, he never apologized, he gave me English lessons, he was my friend. The camp authority is gone now. The men it could not break are mostly gone too. Stockdale died in 2005. Denton died in 2014. Sam Johnson died in 2020. Risner was buried at Arlington in 2013. McCain died of brain cancer in August of 2018, 3 months after Tran Trong Duyet told a reporter in his Haiphong living room that he wished he could vote for him. The men who would not break are silent now. The men who could not break them are old and have always been silent.